Oh, hey there. You think politics is messy now? Let me take you back to the 1920s when America was fresh out of World War I, tired of drama, and just wanted things to go back to normal. Enter Warren G. Harding, a man with a dream he called return to normalcy. Now, normalcy wasn't even a real word, but Harding used it anyway because, well, he wasn't exactly known for being a deep thinker. But the idea behind it was clear: undo the progressive era reforms, pull back government oversight, and let business and the economy do their thing without interference. Before World War I, the progressive era had brought all kinds of regulations, busting monopolies, improving labor conditions, regulating food and drugs, and even putting limits on child labor. But Harding and his administration, they looked at all that and said, too much government, let's roll it back. So, with Harding in charge, the government cut regulations, reduced taxes on business and the wealthy, and stepped back from labor disputes. If the progressives were all about making government an active referee, Harding wanted to be a spectator, just sitting back and letting businesses play however they wanted. With the government stepping out of the way, businesses exploded with growth. Factories were churning, cities were booming, and thanks to Henry Ford and his assembly line, cars were rolling off production lines faster than you could say Model T. Harding's Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, pushed for massive tax cuts for the rich and big corporations. The idea was that if wealthy people and businesses had more money, they'd invest in more factories and jobs, and eventually everyone would benefit. This was called trickle-down economics, but in reality, most of that wealth stayed at the top, while workers barely saw any trickle. Meanwhile, banks were offering easy credit, so people could buy all sorts of new things: cars, radios, washing machines, whether they could afford them or not. This was the age of installment buying, where you didn't need to have the cash right now. You could just make small payments over time. Sounds great, right? Well, it was, until the bills started piling up. Hardin wasn't just about cutting taxes either. He wanted to make sure American businesses didn't have to compete with foreign goods. That's where the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 came in. This tariff raised taxes on imported goods, making foreign products more expensive so that Americans would only buy American-made products. At first, it seemed like a win for American industry. But honey, trade is a two-way street, and other countries retaliated with their own tariffs on American products. Suddenly, American farmers who had been exporting huge amounts of crops during World War I were left with tons of unsold food and dropping prices. This was the first major crack in the 1920s economic boom, though no one seemed to notice at the time. Now, let's talk foreign policy. After World War I, America looked around at Europe and said, yeah, we're going to sit this one out. Harding and his successor, Calvin Coolidge, embraced isolationism, which was a fancy way of saying, your issues are not our problem. The U.S. refused to join the League of Nations. They didn't want to get involved in European conflicts, and even limited immigration through strict quota laws. The idea was that America should focus on itself and not get dragged into other countries' messes. But even while keeping out of global drama, the U.S. did make some moves, like hosting the Washington Naval Conference in 1921 to 1922, where major world powers agreed to limit their battleships. The idea was that fewer ships would mean less war. Cute theory. But let's just say Japan didn't exactly stick to the deal. And just when things seemed calm, along came one of the biggest political scandals in U.S. history, the Teapot Dome scandal. And honey, this was some juicy government corruption. Harding's Secretary of the Interior, Albert B. Fall, secretly leased federal oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private oil companies in exchange for bribes. And we're not talking about small favors. He pocketed hundreds of thousands of dollars. When the public found out, it was a whole thing, and Fall became the first ever U.S. cabinet member to go to prison. Harding himself didn't live to see the full fallout. He conveniently died in 1923, officially from a heart attack, but let's be real, the stress probably didn't help. After Harding's death, Calvin Coolidge took over. And if Harding was all about flashy economic growth, Coolidge was the guy who just let things ride. He famously said, "The business of America is business." And he meant it. He stuck to low taxes, minimal government interference, and the belief that the free market would solve everything. And for many of Americans, the 1920s did feel like an economic miracle. But behind the prosperity, warning signs were everywhere. Farmers were struggling, the wealth gap was growing, and people were gambling on the stock market like it was a casino. With the Federal Reserve keeping interest rates low, banks were practically begging people to borrow money. And what did they do with that borrowed money? They invested it in stocks, but not just regular stocks. They were buying stocks on the margin, meaning they borrowed most of the money to buy the stocks in the first place. It was like a giant economic Jenga tower built on borrowed money and speculation. And honey, when Black Tuesday hit in 1929, that tower collapsed. Now, some of you might be thinking about the Smoot-Hawley Tariff and wondering, wasn't that part of the 1920s policies? Well, not exactly. That tariff was passed in 1930 under President Hoover, and let me tell you, if Fordney-McCumber was bad, Smoot-Hawley was catastrophic. It raised tariffs even higher, killing international trade when America desperately needed it. But that's a story for another episode. So, what's the tea on return to normalcy? Well, it was a time of economic boom, business-friendly policies, and a government that stepped back while corporations stepped up. But behind the prosperity, there were major warning signs. Farmers were struggling, stock speculation was out of control, and the wealth gap was growing. It all looked like a Gatsby party on the surface, but underneath, the Great Depression was just waiting to happen. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, history is just one big messy tea party. See you soon.